The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka remains one of the most iconic aircraft of the Second World War. With its fixed undercarriage, inverted gull wings, and infamous wailing siren, it became the very symbol of Blitzkrieg, a flying herald of destruction. From the invasion of Poland in 1939 to the sweeping victories in France and the early stages of Operation Barbarossa, the Stuka earned a fearsome reputation as the spearhead of Germany's tactical airpower. But as the war wore on, that dominance began to fade. The Allies had closed the gap in the air, and on the Western Front, Stuka squadrons could no longer operate with impunity. Yet, on the vast Eastern Front, the Ju-87 found a second life, not in its original dive-bombing role, but in a new and deadly purpose, hunting Soviet tanks. This is the story of the Ju-87G Stuka, the specialized tank hunting variant that became a formidable threat to Soviet armor, and the daring pilots who turned it into one of the most feared anti-tank weapons on the Eastern Front. By 1943, the Red Army was fielding tanks in overwhelming numbers, and Germany needed a reliable aerial tank killer. Among several aircraft considered for this role, the Ju-87, though aging, remained a top candidate due to its ruggedness, accuracy, and familiarity among Luftwaffe ground attack pilots. One of its strongest advocates was Hans-Ulrich Rudel, the most decorated German pilot of the war. Already a seasoned Stuka ace, Rudel had personally knocked out numerous tanks using 20mm cannon-equipped Ju-87Ds. But the Luftwaffe needed something with more punch. The solution came in the form of a pair of Bordkanone BK 3.7 cannons, adapted from the 3.7cm Flak 18 anti-aircraft gun. Mounted under the wings, these guns gave rise to the Ju-87G, nicknamed Kanonenvogel, or Cannon Bird. It marked the final evolution of the Stuka, a flying tank destroyer designed to meet the Red Army's steel-tied head-on. The transformation of the aging Ju-87 into a tank killer began in the winter of 1943. Using the Ju-87D1 as a test platform, engineers mounted a Flak 18 cannon under each wing in specially designed pods. Though visually cumbersome and weighing nearly 600 pounds apiece, these underwing cannons gave the Stuka the new mission of hunting enemy armor. The first flight of this experimental configuration took place on January 31, 1943, with Hauptmann Hans Karlstepp at the controls. By April of that year, the first production variant, the Ju-87G1, was delivered to frontline squadrons. The twin 3.7cm BK-37 cannons were each fed by a 6-round magazine, loaded with tungsten-cored armor-piercing shells. In the hands of skilled pilots like Hans-Ulrich Rudel, the Kanonenvogel quickly proved its worth against Soviet armor. The G1s were converted from earlier Ju-87D airframes and retained the shorter wingspan and airframe dimensions, but removed the dive brakes, signaling a full shift from dive bombing to ground attack duty. The follow-up G2 variant introduced extended wings borrowed from the Ju-87D5, improving stability and payload capacity. A total of 208 G2s were produced, with at least 22 additional conversions from existing D3 models. With these upgrades, the Ju-87, once considered obsolete, was reborn as a precision tank destroyer for the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front. But the Ju-87G Kanonenvogel wasn't limited to tanks alone. On the vast battlefields of the Eastern Front, its pilots hunted a wide array of targets, from Soviet tanks and self-propelled guns to supply trucks, river barges, artillery batteries, and hardened bunkers. With the front lines in constant motion, Stuka squadrons often operated from improvised forward airfields, flying multiple sorties per day under grueling conditions. The Eastern Front offered no shortage of targets, and few pilots exploited that more than Hans-Ulrich Rudel, whose relentless attacks earned high praise from senior commanders. General Ferdinand Schorner famously remarked, "Rudel alone replaces a whole division." Though the BK 3.7 cm cannon could destroy Soviet tanks, success required precision. The T-34, for instance, had 20 mm of armor on the hull roof and just 16 mm on the turret top. Its hull sides offered 40 mm of protection, sloped at 41 degrees, making it vulnerable but only under the right conditions. To achieve a kill, the Stuka pilot had to approach at a low altitude, steep angle, and fire at no more than 365 meters, a difficult shot that demanded nerve and skill. In early 1943, Hans-Ulrich Rudel was recalled to Germany to lead an experimental anti-tank unit, flying the newly armed Ju-87s fitted with twin 37mm cannons, marking a bold new chapter in the Stuka's evolution. Rudel's unit was first deployed to the Crimean front, where German forces were attempting to repel a major Soviet amphibious landing on the Kuban Peninsula. The results were immediate and devastating. The cannon birds tore into Soviet landing craft ferrying troops and supplies, and Rudel himself claimed the destruction of over 70 vessels during the operation. His remarkable performance earned him the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross, personally awarded by Hitler in recognition of his contributions on the Eastern Front. Shortly afterward, Rudel returned to his elite STG-2 Immelmann dive bombing wing, this time commanding its new Ju-87G1 anti-tank squadron. He would lead them into action during the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, where the Eastern Front became a proving ground for this deadly tank-hunting aircraft. In June 1943, just before Kursk, the German Air Ministry had ordered a limited production run of 20 Ju-87Gs, marking the beginning of this specialized variant's short but deadly operational career. When Operation Citadel, the German offensive at Kursk, began in July 1943, only a handful of the newly armed Ju-87G Kanonenvogel were available for combat. On the opening day of the battle, Hans-Ulrich Rudel flew the only officially designated Ju-87G1 in action. However, several Ju-87D variants had already been modified in the field with underwing 37mm BK cannons, effectively serving as improvised tank-busting aircraft before the G-series was standardized. Despite the limited numbers, the Ju-87G's performance at Kursk impressed commanders. Its ability to take out Soviet armor from the air offered a much-needed counter to the Red Army's growing tank forces. As anticipated, Rudel's newly equipped anti-tank squadron was thrust into the heart of the fighting during Operation Citadel, providing close air support for the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, advancing along the southern axis of the Kursk salient. Flying their Kanonenvogel ahead of the armored spearheads, Rudel and his men targeted Soviet reserve tank columns rushing to the front lines. In a series of aggressive strikes, the squadron claimed dozens of enemy tanks destroyed. Rudel himself allegedly knocked out 12 T-34s in a single day. Through bitter experience, the Stuka pilots learned to exploit the weaknesses of Soviet armor. Engine decks, turret roofs, and rear-mounted fuel drums became primary targets. The telltale exhaust smoke of the T-34s often helped the pilots line up their shots, and a hit to the engine compartment could lead to a devastating secondary explosion. To maximize accuracy, Rudel recommended diving to just 15 meters above the ground, a dangerously low altitude that brought the pilot within effective small arms range. But the slow speed and excellent downward visibility of the Ju-87 made it ideally suited for such pinpoint strikes, allowing pilots ample time to line up their 37mm cannons on target. These missions were perilous, but in skilled hands, the Stuka had been reborn, not as a dive bomber, but as a deadly tank killer. The appearance of the Ju-87G Kanonenvogel on the Eastern Front had an immediate and demoralizing effect on Soviet armored forces. Soviet tank crews and accompanying infantry, often riding exposed atop the rear decks of T-34s, quickly learned to fear the shriek of approaching Stukas. The psychological and physical toll was immediate. Tank units were thrown into disarray, and Soviet morale visibly suffered. To mitigate these losses, Soviet commanders began deploying anti-aircraft guns in close proximity to their armored formations. Mobile AA guns, along with heavy machine guns, were pushed forward to provide direct fire protection against low-flying attackers. In response, Rudel's units adopted new defensive procedures. When a strike by the cannon-armed Stukas was planned, it was now standard to include 2 or more conventional Ju-87s equipped with bombs and machine guns as escort elements. These aircraft circled above the strike group, targeting Soviet flak positions and suppressing hostile fire, as the cannon birds executed their attack runs. They also served as early warning sentinels against Soviet fighter aircraft, which were beginning to reassert control over contested airspace. Despite these precautions, the cost remained high. Rudel's aircraft often limped back to base riddled with bullet holes, a testament to the escalating dangers of air operations on the Eastern Front. Yet, the Kanonenvogel continued to fly, undeterred and deadly. In the aftermath of the failed German offensive at Kursk in July 1943, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed firmly into Soviet hands. Within days of the German withdrawal, the Red Army launched Operation Kutuzov, targeting the Ural salient to the north. The offensive quickly threatened to unhinge the entire northern sector of the German front. To help stem the tide, elements of Stuka Wing Immelmann, including Rudel's newly formed anti-tank group, were urgently redeployed north. Their task was to delay the advancing Soviet forces and provide critical air support to overstretched German ground units scrambling to hold the line. Flying multiple sorties per day, Rudel's cannonbirds operated under increasingly perilous conditions, navigating Soviet air defenses, dwindling Luftwaffe support, and rapidly changing front lines. As the Soviet summer offensives intensified, Rudel's group became a key component of the German defensive effort. In recognition of his leadership and combat effectiveness, Rudel was appointed commander of 3rd STG-2, following the death of the previous group commander in action. By late 1943, Rudel had flown over 1,500 sorties and was credited with the destruction of at least 60 Soviet tanks, numbers that, while partly influenced by wartime propaganda, reflected the increasingly desperate role that the Ju-87G played in delaying Soviet armor breakthroughs. His actions earned him further decorations, including the Oak Leaves and Swords to the Knight's Cross, and cemented his reputation as Germany's most celebrated ground attack pilot. Yet, behind the awards lay a stark reality. The Luftwaffe's aging Stuka force, even in its tank-killing form, was being pushed to its limits in a war it could no longer turn around. During the Soviet winter offensive in Ukraine, Rudel's Stuka squadron repeatedly turned the tide, most notably at the Battle of Kursk in November 1943, where they blunted a major assault by hundreds of T-34s. By now, Rudel had become a central figure in Nazi propaganda, his unit hailed as the Front Fire Brigade for their constant deployment to crisis points. While other dive bomber units transitioned to aircraft like the HS-129 or FW-190, Rudel remained loyal to the Ju-87. Operating from improvised frontline airstrips under harsh conditions, he led from the front, motivating his ground crews to keep damaged aircraft flying, despite freezing temperatures and scarce resources. Rudel's leadership inspired unwavering loyalty. His pilots followed him through mission after mission. He was seemingly fearless. In March 1944, after a successful strike on a Dnieper bridge, his unit was ambushed by Soviet fighters. When one of his men crash-landed in enemy territory, Rudel attempted a daring rescue, landing his own Stuka, only to become stuck in the mud and captured by Soviet troops. Refusing to remain a prisoner, Rudel escaped by swimming across a river and trekking over 50 kilometers on foot. Within 2 days, he returned to German lines, remarkably soon back in the cockpit and flying missions again. By August 1944, Rudel had claimed 320 tank kills in his Ju-87G Kanonenvogel, cementing his reputation as the Luftwaffe's premier tank-busting pilot. Following the collapse of Army Group Center, Rudel's Immelmann wing was shifted north to the Kurland Peninsula and soon thrown into one desperate engagement after another. Promoted to lieutenant colonel in October, Rudel took full command of his beloved wing. But there was little time for celebration. His unit was soon redeployed to Hungary, tasked with aiding SS Panzer divisions in breaking the Soviet siege of Budapest. Facing growing numbers of Soviet fighters, the skies had become far more dangerous. Within days, Rudel was shot down twice but returned to the cockpit, his leg in a plaster cast. By early 1945, Rudel had flown over 2,400 combat missions and claimed 463 tank kills. In January, he became the only recipient of the Knight's Cross with golden oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, Germany's highest military honor. Hitler attempted to ground him, but Rudel refused. As Soviet forces pushed into Silesia, Rudel's wing was sent to blunt the offensive. Operating from airfields inside Germany, his Stukas rescued retreating German troops and attacked Soviet bridgeheads across the Oder River. In one mission alone, Rudel reportedly destroyed 4 tanks before being shot down again. In May 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed, Rudel led the remnants of his wing on a final flight, surrendering to American forces in southern Germany. Hans-Ulrich Rudel played a key role in pioneering the use of cannon-armed aircraft for anti-tank warfare. His tactics and battlefield success with the Ju-87G Stuka during battles like Kursk left a lasting legacy. Decades later, his exploits directly influenced the design philosophy behind the U.S. Air Force's A-10 Thunderbolt II, developed during the Cold War to halt waves of Soviet armor in Central Europe. Like the Stuka, the A-10 was built around a powerful cannon specifically designed for tank destruction.